A sizable portion of what remains of my game collection are two-player games or games that are best with two. On that note, I will say that while most of the games that I'm about to mention are strictly two-player games, there are a few here that can be played with more, but I feel are best at two players, and I'll definitely mention those as they come up. So without any further ado, let us dive into my top 15 two-player games or games that are best with two. Before I start into my number 15 here, I will mention that even the games that are lowest on the list here are superb games. If these games have survived all of my game auctions and collection calls and they remain on my shelf, then to me they are all fantastic games. So even the lowest ones here I consider to be truly top-notch board games. And with that, we'll talk about my number 15, which is a truly brilliant abstract game, a very chess-like game even, and that is a game called Hive. I have the Hive Pocket version here, which is just a smaller version of Hive. And it's a game that has just wonderful, chunky backlight or bakelite or whatever you call it, the plastic pieces, each one representing different bugs, and each of the bugs has different movement capabilities, with the idea of the game being to fully surround your opponent's queen piece. It's one of those no-luck, highly tactical games that I would imagine would reward a lot of study and a lot of in-depth strategy education, sort of along the lines of chess. But I think it's a really neat game in that once you learn how each of the pieces move, you can just basically dive in and play even as an inexperienced player. So that's my number 15, Hive. My number 14 game is a classic two-player deck builder. That's a little game called Star Realms. This is a totally stripped down two-player confrontational deck building game where the goal of the game is to essentially reduce your opponent's life to zero by attacking them with your various spaceships and whatnot. The very first time I ever played the game, I used the physical cards. Ever since then, I've pretty much been playing on the online implementation, or the app version, I guess it would be. Although I mainly play on my PC at this point against the AI, but it is really a very approachable two-player deck builder. My number 13 game was co-designed by Theo Riviere and one of my favorite designers, Bruno Cathala, and that is a two-player game, surprisingly, called Nagaraja. This is a really interesting game of card play, and rather than rolling dice, you're rolling these fate sticks that are basically rectangular shaped things that have four sides on them when you roll them. And there's some really unique and clever things going on with this game that make it really unlike any other game I have. It's a neat design that I don't know has really gotten a lot of attention, but I think people who are fans of two-player tactical games really should take a look at it. It's a very interesting game. My number 12 is a little game called Steam Torpedo, where two battling submarines are trying to more or less destroy their opponent's submarine, and they're doing so through tactical movement of the crew within the submarine, running from room to room to activate various effects and abilities on the sub. Well, I had a chance to play the game a couple of times shortly after I got it. I really haven't had a chance to explore it since then, and I'd really love to find an opponent to play this one with, just because there seems to be some interesting things going on that I'd like to dive into. Submarines, dive, oh dear. So that was my number 12, Steam Torpedo. My number 11 is a strictly two-player version of a very popular game that I don't happen to enjoy very much. So this is Seven Wonders Duel, based of course on the original Seven Wonders. I'm just not a big fan of Seven Wonders. It's not one that really grabbed me, but the Duel version is very interesting. I can't quite articulate why I do like it much more than the multiplayer version of the game, but it does feel different, and maybe it's more focused, I'm not sure, but it's one that I certainly enjoy. With my number 10, we're going to go back to Bruno Cathala. I sure love his two-player, fairly simple tactical games, and this is one of those, a game called Raptor. It's a very asymmetrical game where one player plays a group of scientists who are attempting to capture some baby dinosaurs to study, and the other player plays as the dinosaurs and the dino's mother, who's attempting to ward off and eat the scientists and prevent them from taking her babies. So I don't actually love that theme of scientists trying to steal these babies from Mama Dino, but the game itself is really fun in its simultaneous card play, where players are sort of trying to get into the head of their opponents and trying to outguess what might be coming at them from the other side of the table. So it's got a so-so theme, a really horrendous cover. I mean, there aren't very many worse covers in board gaming, I don't think, than this one. But the game itself keeps me coming back to it quite a bit. It's a very highly played game in my collection. It's also one of those games where it feels very hard to win as the dinos, and for inexperienced players it can feel like the game is quite imbalanced, but as players gain experience over several plays, that sort of balance evens out a bit, and I think the two sides are fairly even once both players are kind of aware of how their side plays. Alright, my number 9, much like Nagaraja was, is a very unique and interesting game, and that is Acro Tierie. This has a few different mechanisms that work together in just such a fascinating way. It involves card play, pick up and deliver mechanisms, exploration, and sort of deduction to a certain extent, and it's just a really unique mix of several different mechanisms that come together to make a very interesting game. I guess if you get the other version of this game, you could play it as a 3 or 4 player game too, I believe, but the base game as it is was designed as a 2-player game, and it's a clever one at that. So my number 8 now is a little wee game called Shadows in Kyoto. I've talked about it before. I've sung its praises, even though I never see anyone talking about this little Stratego-inspired game. But it's just a really quite clever game of bluffing and deduction and clever movement, and there's just these Stratego memories that it brings back to me from my childhood. It's kind of along the lines of Lord of the Rings, The Confrontation, a similar Stratego-inspired thing. And it's another one that I've only played a couple times and would just really love to dive into more and explore it. But that's my number 8, Shadows in Kyoto. So we're roughly halfway here. I'm going to clean up the table and dive into part 2. And just while I have a second here, I want to thank you for just taking the time to hang out with me. I want to thank those of you who have subscribed. I think a number of people have seen me recently on the Dice Towers Board Game Breakfast and Favorite Game Friday shows and have come to hang out with me here on my channel. And I just want to welcome you, and I appreciate you being here. I want to give a special thank you to my Patreon subscriber, Joanna, and encourage other people to check out my Patreon link that's in the video description here. So I just wanted to let you know that you're appreciated, and with that, let's get back to the countdown at number 7 here. The Quest for El Dorado, another game based around the deck building mechanism, and the reason that for me, this game works better with 2 players is because at 2 players, each player controls 2 explorers who are racing to get to the end of the pathway boards thingy. And so their hand of cards that they are deck building ends up getting much more use, significantly more use than in 3 or 4 player games. One problem I had with the base game at 3 or 4 players is the fact that the best strategy was to use your cards to move on the map rather than using them to buy more cards to build a really cool deck of cards. I spent some time playing the game solo with different strategies, and it really wasn't the unbeatable strategy was to try to ignore the deck building aspect and just move on the map, which was disappointing to me to find out. But that could be overcome by either making a longer map so that you have more time to cycle through your cards and build your deck, or play the 2-player game where your hand of cards is controlling 2 players who must work their way to the end of the course. So the fact that the 2-player game allows me to do more deck building and make more use of the cards that I collect is why I prefer it at 2 players. So that was number 7. My number 6 is one of the more recent new to me games, although I guess I've been playing it for a little over a year now. And that is Magic the Gathering. Sure, there are formats where you can play multiplayer or more than 2 players, but I personally have only ever played it at 2 and enjoy it quite a bit. I'm not sure if I really enjoy the politicking that would come with playing with, for example, Commander with 4 players. I think that's what it's called, Commander format. But anyways, yeah, I'm totally happy to play it at 2. And I've had loads and loads of fun hours just building deck after deck after deck. Not enough time since the pandemic occurred to actually test those decks out and play them against people. All I'm doing is deck building, so now I've got this massive pile of something like 38 unique decks that I've made, and many of them I haven't actually got to play. But one of these days, I'll get back into playing Magic again, and in the meantime, I'll enjoy the deck building. My number 5 is cheating a little bit, although I cheat even worse coming up further in this list. But this is a game I haven't played, and it's my number 5. It is 878 Vikings, Invasions of England. However, I have played essentially previous iterations of the game system. I've played 1812 and I've played 1779, and those were both part of the sort of same series of games, very much the same style. So I know from having played those two previous games that I'm going to love this when I can finally get it to the table. I don't know when that'll happen though, considering I don't really have any game friends at the moment. But it's a dream I have to one day play this game, my number 5 two-player game of all time. Number 4, I'm going to have to make a little room for here. Excuse me. This is Battles of Westeros, which is for me the peak, the greatest of the Commands and Colors line of games, which is a fabulous series of games that span different historical periods or even some fantasy eras. And they're all based around playing cards to activate figures on a map. Now, I did get to dive into the first base game here several years back. A friend of mine and I were playing through the whole campaign, and I was just loving it. It's such a great system. It's not a simple one. It's certainly quite complex. The rules aren't very well written. If you're going to learn the game, I highly suggest to go to the Board Game Geek files for the game and download the fan updated rulebook, which really helps to fix a lot of the problems the original rulebook had. But despite the fact that it's a complex game, there's a lot going on, a lot of rules, exceptions, and things to learn. It can be a fairly long game too, especially when you take into account the setup and tear down of the map and all the elements that go with that. But despite all of that, it is just such a delight to have all these little minis representing tons and tons of different units when you count all the expansions, because at some point this game went on clearance sale everywhere. I guess people were trying to unload their stock. I guess it mustn't have been as popular as they were hoping. But when I saw the clearance prices everything was going at, I just snapped up everything that was available for Battles of Westeros. So I have the entire collection jam-packed into these 2 big boxes here. And one day, again, hopefully I'll have an opponent to start playing through some of these campaigns with and just push little soldiers around on the map, which, let's be honest, is half the fun. So number 4, a big game, although there's a bigger one to come, so stay tuned. But meanwhile, I have my number 3, which is an even bigger cheat than 878 Vikings was, because not only have I not played this game, but I haven't played anything quite like it either. So I'm just guessing based on reading the rule book, watching videos, strictly going by what I know. I think that when I finally get a chance to play this game, it's going to be in the number 3 position. And that is Warhammer Underworld's Night Vault. Now that I think about it, it's kind of similar to Battles of Westeros in that players are using a hand of cards to control figures on a map that are battling amongst each other. However, one thing that has me excited about Night Vault here is the fact that you get to deck build your cards that you play for your little faction. There are a bunch of little factions that I have on the shelf here for this game. I have 6 additional factions in addition to the 2 that came in the base box. Each of those factions has their own unique deck of cards from which you can select the cards you play for the match. So you can really tune your faction to play in one way or another and just battle it out and see how it goes. So first things first, I need to assemble and paint the figures and then find an opponent who will play the game with me. But I am super excited to try it. It looks like it'll hit some of the really big things that get me excited about board gaming, such as deck building and minis and highly tactical board play. And so yeah, those are some of the things that really kind of get me excited about gaming, and that's why I have it at my number 3. My number 2 is a whole game system as well, actually, and that's the Mr. Jack system. Now, I made a fairly lengthy video covering the entire series of Mr. Jack games, of which I include Le Fantôme de l'Opéra, because it's very much in the same style as the Mr. Jack games, as you would know if you watched that video. The game from that series that I'm going to have in the number 2 position here is my favorite of the bunch, and that is Mr. Jack in New York. This is another theme that I don't particularly enjoy. I don't like the association to Jack the Ripper. It's really not necessary. It has nothing to do with the actual gameplay. But there's something about deduction games that really gets me going. I've always kind of enjoyed detective stuff. As a young child, I read through all the Hardy Boys books and all the Sherlock Holmes stories and really dove into the detective fiction. And so when I have a chance to be a detective and play a deduction game, then I'm definitely all in. So Mr. Jack in New York is my number 2 two-player game. Now my number 1 is the biggest. Again, I have to clear some room and grab a two-player game that can be played 3 or 4, but it's a two-player game. And that is War of the Ring. Yeah, so I have the anniversary edition here with all the cool painted minis and the enlarged map and all that stuff. But War of the Ring has given me hours and hours and hours of fun playing over the past several years. Now, unfortunately, the primary opponent was my wife, and she's no longer in the picture, so I've kind of lost my War of the Ring opponent. But for those who are fans of the Lord of the Rings IP and can handle massively complex, very long play times, and really deep strategy, this is the game for you. It's a very asymmetrical game where one player is Sauron and the forces of evil, the other player is the Ring Bearer and the forces of good, and both sides play very differently in very interesting ways, and it's just a true masterpiece of game design. Now, if you're not into the Lord of the Rings IP and you're not into heavy, long games, definitely avoid this one. And for me, I do tend to avoid longer, more complex games these days. As the years have gone by, I've really gravitated much towards light to medium weight games and have not had an interest in playing the longer, heavier ones, with the exception of Gloomhaven being my number 1 game. It's a big exception, of course, but for the most part, I guess really in the 10 years since I've had kids, I've really gone more towards the lighting gaming side. But fortunately, I discovered War of the Ring before I made that little transition, and now that I'm reading the books to my older kid, maybe one day when he's old enough, he'll have the interest to try this one with me. So, that is War of the Ring, my number 1 two-player game. I haven't tried it at 3 or 4 because it just doesn't look like nearly as interesting an experience. Although, having said that, with the right people who are very familiar with the game, I don't know, maybe it could be interesting. But anyways, I want to hear from you. What are some of your favorite two-player games or games that play best with 2? I'm always happy to hear your recommendations. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following. Give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers. Number 15 is a brilliant... Before I stop, where basically, it's not one that really hit me. I guess if you get people have seen me recently on the Dice Tower board game. This is a game that plays 2 to 4 players, but in my opinion is best with 2. And I haven't got my other games. Whoops. And I lost my train of thought. I've played 1812. Lord of the Ring,